What you're looking at right now is not a political disagreement. What you are witnessing in real time is the constitutional architecture of the United States of America being stress tested in ways that the founders never explicitly imagined and yet somehow prepared for. On Easter Sunday, the sitting president of the United States went on Truth Social and typed out words that no American president has ever dared to put in public. Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one, in Iran. Open the Strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah. That's not a tweet. That's not a blunder. That is a president of the United States, in writing, publicly broadcasting his intent to destroy civilian infrastructure in a foreign nation, the very definition of what international law calls a war crime. And then 2 days later, he posted on Truth Social that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Let that sink in. The man with his finger on the nuclear trigger said an entire civilization would die. And that is precisely, word for word, case for case, the reason the 25th Amendment exists, not as a political weapon, not as a partisan tool, but as a constitutional safeguard written in the blood of American history, designed for exactly this kind of moment, when the person holding the most powerful office on earth shows the world, and shows it clearly, that something has gone deeply, dangerously wrong. Now let's talk about what is actually happening here, because most of what you are hearing on television is noise, political theater dressed up as constitutional debate, and the American people deserve better than that. They deserve the unvarnished truth. They deserve context. They deserve history. And they deserve someone to stand up and say what this situation really is without flinching and without softening the edges. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched an air war against Iran, killing its supreme leader and many other officials, destroying a large number of military and government targets and killing civilians. That is how this started, not with a diplomatic failure, not with a provocation from Iran that left America no choice. It started with an offensive military operation launched without a declaration of war from Congress, launched without the formal authorization that the Constitution of the United States explicitly requires. And the American people were told, as they are always told in these situations, that it was necessary, that it was surgical, that it was righteous. And here we are, more than 40 days into a conflict that has now produced one of the most dangerous geopolitical crises of the 21st century, with a president publicly threatening to exterminate a civilization on social media while his cabinet says nothing, does nothing, and smiles for the cameras. Let's be precise about what the 25th Amendment actually is, because the politicians on your screen are using it like a bumper sticker when it is in fact one of the most serious constitutional mechanisms ever written into American law. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967. The push for Congress to formalize a blueprint for handling presidential disability gained traction after President John F. Kennedy's 1963 assassination. Think about that. America had just watched its president get shot in the head in broad daylight, and Congress looked at the line of succession and realized there was no clear constitutional framework for what happens when a president becomes unable, not unwilling, but unable to discharge the duties of office. Section 4 of that amendment is the one everyone is talking about right now. It says in plain English that if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet determine that the president is unable to perform the duties of his office, they can transfer executive power to the vice president, not permanently, not as a coup, but as a constitutional safety valve, a release mechanism. The founders knew, and the Congress of 1967 knew, that there would come a day when the person sitting in that chair might not be able to make sound decisions. And they built a door, a constitutional door. And right now, for the first time in American history, that door is being rattled by people on both sides of the political aisle. By Tuesday afternoon, more than 50 House Democrats, along with Senators Ed Markey and Ron Wyden, had called for the president's removal through impeachment or the 25th Amendment. That is not a fringe position. That is more than 50 elected representatives of the American people standing up and saying, on the record, that they believe the president of the United States is unfit to hold office. And what makes this moment genuinely different, what separates it from every previous time Democrats have floated impeachment against Trump, is who else is saying it. Former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, once a strong ally of the president, called his rhetoric evil and madness and wrote on social platform X, 25th Amendment, not a single bomb has dropped on America. We cannot kill an entire civilization. Think about that name for a moment. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the woman who spent years as one of Trump's most loyal defenders, his most enthusiastic cheerleader, is now calling his words evil. That is not a political disagreement. That is a moral reckoning. That is someone who was inside the movement, looking at what the movement has become and recoiling from what she sees. And she was not alone in the conservative camp. Tucker Carlson, who previously campaigned for Trump in 2024, delivered a scathing critique, calling the president's Easter post vile on every level and accusing him of mocking both Islam and Christianity, and further condemned Trump's willingness to target civilian infrastructure, labeling it a potential war crime. Tucker Carlson, the man who built a media empire defending Donald Trump, the man who sat with Vladimir Putin and gave the Kremlin a platform while American journalists were rotting in Russian prisons. Tucker Carlson looked at that Truth Social post and said, "This is a war crime." War. That tells you something, not about Tucker Carlson's politics, but about the severity of what was posted. When your most enthusiastic defenders start using the words war crime and 25th Amendment, you have crossed a line that cannot be walked back by a press briefing. Now, let's talk about the reality of what is happening on the ground, because the social media posts do not exist in a vacuum. They exist inside a war, a real war. A strike hit an elementary school early in the war, killing about 170 children, and Iranian officials said a major university was bombed. 170 children in a school, and the official position is that this was not deliberate targeting of civilians. But when the president of the United States goes on social media and announces that Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, when he publicly, in writing, telegraphs his intent to destroy civilian infrastructure, the legal and moral distinction between deliberate and accidental begins to collapse. International experts warned that attacking power, water, or basic infrastructure upon which tens of millions of civilians depend would constitute a war crime, a betrayal of the values this nation was founded on, and a moral failure. That is not the language of fringe activists. That is the language of international law, the Geneva Conventions, the laws that America helped write after World War II, when this country stood in the ashes of fascism and said, "Never again." A global food crisis could develop if normal traffic doesn't resume through the Strait of Hormuz soon, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization warned, noting that substantial proportions of the world's supply of products required for farming, including oil, natural gas, urea, and fertilizers, are currently choked off from global markets. Let that reach you, not as a headline, but as a human reality. Farmers around the world who cannot get fertilizer, food supplies that cannot move, prices that are already destroying the purchasing power of working families in this country. Oil topped $100 a barrel again as the blockade threatens to further disrupt the global economy and keep gas prices elevated. This is what war does. This is what happens when the most powerful nation on earth decides that military force is the answer and then executes that decision without congressional authorization, without a coherent diplomatic framework, and without any clear definition of what victory actually looks like. And about that word, victory, Trump has used it repeatedly. On March 9th, Trump said that the war is very complete, pretty much, and falsely claimed that the Iranian military had been destroyed and the Strait of Hormuz had reopened. He said that on March 9th. And yet here we are in April with the Strait still contested, with oil at $100 a barrel, with a fragile 2-week ceasefire that has already been violated by both sides, and with American naval forces now beginning a blockade of Iranian ports that the IRGC has vowed to resist with force. That is not victory. That is the morphology of a conflict that has no exit strategy, prosecuted by an administration that confused shock and awe with strategic clarity. Now, let's be honest about what the 25th Amendment conversation actually is and is not. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment has never been invoked and would require buy-in from Vice President J.D. Vance, the cabinet, and eventually 2/3 of Congress if Trump argued he is not incapacitated. J.D. Vance, who would assume the role of president if the 25th Amendment were invoked, was not in Washington when all of this was unfolding. He was on a stage in Budapest lauding Trump while speaking in support of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. That detail is not incidental, it is illuminating. The man who would have to be the constitutional trigger for presidential removal is abroad, at a rally celebrating a right-wing nationalist leader, publicly praising the president whose fitness for office is being questioned back home. That is the cabinet dynamic you are dealing with. That is the political reality inside which the 25th Amendment either lives or dies as a viable mechanism. The chance of Trump being removed from office is low, with his cabinet members, who would have to play an active role in invoking the 25th Amendment, routinely publicly praising him. And yet, And yet the very fact that the conversation is happening, the very fact that it has moved from progressive Twitter accounts to the floor of the House of Representatives to the mouths of former Trump allies tells you something important about where the country is, about where the limits of acceptable presidential behavior are being redrawn in real time. Because even if the 25th Amendment is never invoked, even if Trump serves out his term and leaves the White House on his own terms, the conversation itself is a marker. It is a constitutional data point. It is America asking itself out loud in public, is there a point at which the behavior of a president becomes incompatible with the responsibilities of the office? And if so, who decides and by what mechanism? Trump has actually mused about the 25th Amendment himself. During a March 26 cabinet meeting while talking about Iran, Trump said, "I can't say what we're going to do because if I did, I wouldn't be sitting here for long. They'd probably, what is it called? The 25th Amendment, huh? They'd institute the 25th Amendment, which they didn't do with Biden, which is shocking." There it is, out of his own mouth. The president of the United States joking about, or perhaps warning about, the constitutional mechanism designed to remove him while discussing an active military conflict. The man knows the word, he understands the concept, and he used it as a kind of rhetorical dare, as if to say, try it. As if the invocation of a constitutional safeguard is itself a political attack rather than a legal process. That framing is deeply revealing. It tells you how this administration understands constitutional accountability, not as a system of checks designed to protect the republic, but as an obstacle, as an enemy weapon, as something to be mocked and defied. More than 5 weeks after the U.S. and Israel launched the war, Trump agreed to suspend planned attacks on Iranian infrastructure for 2 weeks, backing off his shocking threats to imminently order the destruction of Iran's whole civilization. He called it a victory. He said the United States had met and exceeded all military objectives. He credited Pakistan for the mediation. He called it a big day for world peace. And the stock market went up. Oil prices went down temporarily, and Washington exhaled. But here is what that ceasefire actually is. It is an admission, an implicit admission that the threats were bluster, that the plan to destroy a whole civilization was never going to happen, or at least not on that Tuesday. And the question that no one in the administration wants to answer is this: if the plan was never really going to happen, then what was that Truth Social post? If it was genuine, it was the ravings of a man who should not have access to nuclear codes. If it was theater, if it was negotiating strategy dressed up as apocalyptic threat, then the president of the United States used the prospect of civilizational annihilation as a bargaining chip. And I want you to sit with both of those options because neither one of them is acceptable. Neither one of them is what American leadership is supposed to look like on the world stage. Iran claimed victory, asserting that it had forced the U.S. to accept its 10-point plan, which includes lifting all sanctions on Iran and withdrawing all U.S. forces from all bases in the region. That is the Iranian read of this ceasefire. Not a capitulation, a victory. The country that Trump said had its military destroyed, whose whole civilization was going to die on a Tuesday evening, is now claiming that it won. And the fragility of the ceasefire itself, already violated on multiple fronts, with the U.S. military now enforcing a blockade of Iranian ports while Iran's Revolutionary Guard threatens any vessel that approaches the Strait, tells you that this conflict is nowhere near over. The U.S. military said it will enforce a blockade on all traffic entering and leaving Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz in accordance with Trump's demand after talks faltered. The 2-week ceasefire that was supposed to be the beginning of peace has already collapsed into a new phase of confrontation. And the American people are being asked again to trust that the man in the White House has a plan. What this moment in American history actually demands is not partisan performance. It is not Democrats versus Republicans. It is not MAGA versus the resistance. It is something far more fundamental. It is a question about the moral architecture of American power, about whether the United States government, when it makes decisions that will determine whether civilizations live or die, is accountable to anyone, to Congress, to the Constitution, to the people who elected it. The 25th Amendment was not written for political convenience. It was written because the founders and the Congress of 1967 understood that power without accountability is not governance. It is tyranny with better branding. And right now, the world is watching the most powerful nation in the history of this planet conduct a war without congressional authorization, threaten civilizational annihilation on social media, and then claim victory when the apocalypse it announced does not arrive on schedule. The question is not whether the 25th Amendment will be invoked. The question is whether the American people understand clearly and fully what it means that we are having this conversation at all.